The desert sun beat down on the locomotive, baking the metal skin of the iron horse. Inside, Black Bart Barlow, a man whose name whispered fear across the territories, adjusted his silk cravat. Today was the day his grand scheme would come to fruition. Not only would he secure the gold shipment heading to Denver, but he'd also solidify his future with the coerced nuptials to Miss Abigail Honeycutt, the sole heir to the Honeycutt fortune. Abigail, pale and trembling, sat across from him. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with despair. She clutched a small, embroidered handkerchief, its delicate stitches a stark contrast to the rough reality of her situation. Bart, ever the charmer in his own twisted way, offered her a glass of champagne. "To our future, my dear," he toasted, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Abigail refused, turning her head to the window, watching the endless expanse of the prairie blur past. Unbeknownst to Bart, a shadow moved amongst the coal dust and steam of the engine. Dusty, a cowboy with eyes as blue as the summer sky and a heart as vast as the open range, had infiltrated the train. He had heard of Bart's cruel intentions and couldn't stand idly by while Abigail was forced into a life of misery. He knew Abigail from back home. They'd shared stolen glances across the town square and whispered dreams under starry nights. He wouldn't let a villain like Bart steal her away. Dusty, disguised as a lowly engine wiper, moved with a quiet determination. His calloused hands, more accustomed to wrangling cattle than cleaning machinery, expertly loosened bolts and tampered with the train's couplings. He had a plan, a risky one, but one that offered Abigail a chance at freedom. He timed it perfectly. Just past Widowmaker's Gulch, where the tracks ran precariously close to a steep ravine, the couplings would give way. Dusty finished with the last coupling, wiping his brow with a soot-stained rag. He knew this was a gamble, a desperate play for Abigail's freedom. He just hoped he hadn't underestimated Bart's ruthlessness. He needed to find Abigail, warn her, and get her to a safe place within the carriage before the explosion. He moved through the train cars, careful to avoid Bart's watchful eyes and the gaze of his burly henchmen. These were men loyal to Bart, mean through and through. They'd stop at nothing to please their boss. Dusty passed a fancy dining car, the tables set with fine china and gleaming silverware, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of their situation. He imagined Abigail forced to smile and pretend everything was all right, while her heart ached for escape. Finally, he spotted her, sitting alone in a plush velvet seat, staring out the window. He slipped into the seat beside her, his presence startling her. "Dusty," she gasped, her eyes widening with surprise and a flicker of hope. "What are you doing here? It's too dangerous." "I couldn't let him do this, Abigail," Dusty said, his voice low and urgent. "I have a plan, but you need to trust me. It's going to get rough." He quickly explained his sabotage, the impending explosion, and the need to be prepared. Abigail listened intently, her fear slowly replaced by a steely resolve. She knew Dusty wouldn't put her in unnecessary danger. He was her only hope. "When it happens," Dusty continued, "hold on tight and stay close to me. We'll get through this together." Abigail reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I trust you, Dusty," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm ready." Little did they know, Bart's suspicions had been piqued. He'd noticed a new face amongst the engine crew, and his gut told him something was amiss. He was already on his way to Abigail's carriage, a sinister glint in his eyes. Bart strode down the corridor, his boots echoing on the plush carpet. He could feel the change in the train's rhythm, a subtle vibration that set his teeth on edge. Something was definitely wrong. He reached Abigail's door and, without knocking, threw it open. "What's going on here?" he barked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Dusty and Abigail holding hands. Dusty stood up, placing himself between Bart and Abigail. "Just paying my respects, Bart," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "wishing the happy couple all the best." Bart's face contorted with rage. "You. What are you doing on my trains?" Seems like I'm not the only one with secrets, Bart, Dusty replied, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Before Bart could react, the train lurched violently. A deafening roar filled the air as the couplings gave way, sending the passenger car careening off the tracks. Screams erupted as passengers were thrown from their seats. The lights flickered and died, plunging the car into darkness. Dusty grabbed Abigail, pulling her close as the car bounced and swayed, throwing them against the walls. They braced themselves as best they could, holding on to each other for dear life. The world turned upside down as the car hurtled towards the ravine. Bart, knocked off his feet, scrambled for purchase, his eyes wide with panic. His carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, quite literally. He clung to a seat, cursing Dusty's name with every breath. Then, with a final, earth-shattering crash, the car came to a stop, lying on its side in the depths of the ravine. The world was silent for a moment, save for the groans of twisted metal and the cries of the injured. Dusty and Abigail lay tangled together, bruised but alive. They had survived the crash, but their ordeal was far from over. Dusty groaned, pushing a heavy piece of twisted metal off of himself. Abigail stirred beside him, coughing in the dust-filled air. "Dusty, are you all right?" she asked, her voice weak. "I'm fine, Abigail," he replied, helping her to sit up. "Are you hurt?" She winced, touching her arm. "Just a few bruises, I think." They looked around the wreckage. The once luxurious passenger car was now a mangled mess of splintered wood, torn velvet, and shattered glass. Passengers were moaning and calling out for help. Bart was nowhere to be seen. "We need to get out of here," Dusty said, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "It's not safe." He helped Abigail to her feet, and together they began to pick their way through the debris. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning coal. They climbed over overturned seats and piles of luggage, their progress slow and difficult. As they reached the door, they saw Bart staggering towards them, his face covered in soot and his clothes torn. He was clutching a pistol in his hand, his eyes filled with a murderous rage. "You," he roared, pointing the gun at Dusty. "You'll pay for this." Dusty pushed Abigail behind him, shielding her from Bart's wrath. "It's over, Bart," he said, his voice firm. "Your plan failed." Bart laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Failed? This is just a minor setback. I still have you, and I still have Abigail, and I'm still going to get that gold." Before Dusty could react, Bart fired the pistol. The bullet whizzed past Dusty's head, narrowly missing him. He lunged forward, tackling Bart to the ground. The two men grappled in the dirt, fighting for control of the gun. Abigail watched in horror, unsure of what to do. The struggle was fierce and desperate, each man determined to win. Their lives depended on it. Dusty managed to wrestle the pistol from Bart's grasp, tossing it aside. He landed a solid punch, connecting with Bart's jaw. Bart stumbled back, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Dusty grabbed Abigail's hand and pulled her away from the wreckage. "Run, Abigail, run," he shouted, urging her forward. They scrambled through the underbrush, the thick foliage tearing at their clothes. They didn't dare look back, knowing that Bart wouldn't give up easily. They had to put as much distance between themselves and him as possible. As they ran, Dusty remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell him about Widowmaker's Gulch. It was a treacherous place, full of hidden dangers, but it also offered a chance to disappear, to lose themselves in the wilderness. He knew they had to reach the river, the one that snaked its way through the bottom of the gulch. If they could cross it, they might have a chance to escape. They stumbled and fell, their bodies aching with exhaustion. But they pressed on, driven by the will to survive and the hope of a future together. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air grew cooler and the sounds of the forest came alive. Finally, they reached the riverbank. The water was cold and fast-flowing, but they had no choice. They had to cross it. Dusty helped Abigail wade into the water, his strong arms supporting her as they made their way across the treacherous current. The water swirled around their legs, threatening to sweep them away. But they held on tight, their determination unwavering. They reached the other side, shivering and exhausted. They collapsed on the riverbank, catching their breath. They had made it. For now, at least, they were safe. But they knew that Bart was still out there, searching for them. Their journey was far from over. They had to find a place to hide, a place to rest, a place to plan their next move. They were alone in the wilderness, with nothing but each other. And that, they realized, was all they needed. The moonlight painted the riverbank in silver hues as Dusty started a small fire, the flames licking at the dry wood and casting dancing shadows around them. Abigail shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The cold water had chilled her to the bone. "Here," Dusty said, offering her his coat. "It's not much, but it'll help." All right. Abigail gratefully accepted the coat, snuggling into its warmth. She looked at Dusty, his face illuminated by the firelight. He was bruised and battered, but his eyes still shone with a fierce determination. She couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for him. He had risked everything to save her. "Thank you, Dusty," she said, her voice soft, "for everything." Dusty smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'd do anything for you, Abigail," he said. "You know that." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the night. The wilderness seemed vast and unforgiving, but it also felt strangely peaceful. They were alone, but they weren't lonely. They had each other. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the distance. Dusty's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's out there," he whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he carried on his belt. He quickly extinguished the fire, plunging them into darkness. They crouched low to the ground, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely someone approaching. Dusty motioned for Abigail to stay behind him. He crept forward, his senses on high alert. He could hear the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. He peered through the darkness, trying to make out the figure, and then he saw it. A shadowy figure emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was Bart, and he wasn't alone. He had brought his men with him. Their escape had been short-lived. The hunt was back on. "We have to go," Dusty whispered, grabbing Abigail's hand. "Now." They slipped into the darkness, moving as quietly as possible. They knew they couldn't outrun Bart and his men, but they could try to outsmart them. Dusty led Abigail through the dense undergrowth, using his knowledge of the land to their advantage. He knew the best paths, the hidden trails, the places where they could find cover. They moved quickly and silently, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear Bart and his men crashing through the underbrush behind them, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. They were closing in. Dusty spotted a narrow crevice in a rock face. "In here," he whispered, pulling Abigail towards it. They squeezed into the crevice, huddling together in the darkness. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it offered them a temporary hiding place. They held their breath, listening intently as Bart and his men passed by. "They couldn't have gone far," they heard Bart say, his voice filled with anger. "Spread out and find them. I want them alive." Dusty and Abigail remained hidden in the crevice for what seemed like an eternity. They could hear Bart and his men searching for them, their voices echoing through the trees. They were terrified of being discovered, but they knew they had to stay put. It was their only chance. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the voices faded away. Dusty cautiously peeked out of the crevice. The coast was clear. They were alone again. "We need to find a better hiding place," Dusty said, his voice low. "Somewhere they'll never think to look." He thought for a moment, his mind racing. And then he remembered something his grandfather had told him, a story about a hidden cave deep within the gulch, a place where outlaws used to hide from the law. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. "I know a place," Dusty said, "but it's going to be a long and dangerous journey." Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's go." The journey to the hidden cave was arduous and fraught with peril. The terrain was rough and unforgiving, a maze of jagged rocks, thorny bushes, and steep inclines. They had to climb over fallen logs, scramble up rocky slopes, and navigate through dense thickets. Their clothes were torn, their bodies were bruised, and their spirits were weary. They faced dangers beyond Bart and his men. Once they startled a rattlesnake, its warning rattle sending shivers down their spines. Dusty quickly drew his knife and killed the snake before it could strike. Another time, they heard the howl of a coyote in the distance, a chilling reminder of the wildness that surrounded them. As they traveled, Abigail began to rely on Dusty more and more. She had always admired his strength and courage, but now she saw a different side of him, a tenderness and protectiveness that touched her heart. He helped her over difficult terrain, shared his meager rations with her, and kept her spirits up with stories of his life on the ranch. "You know," Abigail said one evening as they rested by a small stream, "I never really understood what it meant to be strong until now." "You're the strongest person I know, Dusty." Dusty smiled, his cheeks flushed with pride. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," he said. "I couldn't let Bart hurt you." "It's more than that, Dusty," Abigail said, her eyes searching his. "You're brave and kind, and you make me feel safe. I never thought I could feel safe again after everything that's happened." Dusty reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You are safe, Abigail," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "I promise you I won't let anything happen to you." As they continued their journey, their feelings for each other deepened. They were drawn together by their shared experiences, their mutual respect, and their growing attraction. They were two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos and danger. And they were determined to survive, not just for themselves, but for each other. After several days of relentless travel, they finally reached the entrance to the hidden cave. It was a narrow opening concealed behind a curtain of vines and overgrown bushes. Dusty carefully pulled the vines aside, revealing a dark and foreboding passageway. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The entrance to the cave." Abigail hesitated, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Are you sure this is safe, Dusty?" she asked. "It's the safest place I know," Dusty replied, "but we have to be careful, we don't know what's inside." He took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, Abigail following close behind. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, and the silence was deafening. They could hear the drip, drip, drip of water echoing through the cavern. Dusty lit a torch, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. They slowly made their way deeper into the cave, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The cave was surprisingly large, with several different chambers and passageways. As they explored, they discovered signs that others had been there before them. They found old campfire rings, discarded bones, and faded drawings on the walls. It was clear that the cave had been used as a hideout for many years. "This place is creepy," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "I don't like it here." "We don't have a choice, Abigail," Dusty replied. "It's the best chance we have of staying safe." They found a small chamber near the back of the cave and decided to make it their temporary home. Dusty gathered some dry leaves and branches and started a fire. The warmth of the flames helped to chase away the chill and the darkness. As they sat by the fire, Abigail couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for Dusty's courage and resourcefulness. He had led her to safety, protected her from danger, and kept her spirits up even in the darkest of times. She knew that she was falling in love with him, and she couldn't imagine her life without him. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the entrance of the cave. Dusty quickly extinguished the fire and grabbed his knife. They held their breath, listening intently. The noise came again, closer this time. Someone was coming, and they were not alone. It was Bart, and he had finally found them. Dusty quickly snuffed out the torch, plunging the cave into complete darkness. He grabbed Abigail's hand and whispered, "We have to get out of here. There's another way out of the cave, a back entrance, but we have to be quiet." They crept through the darkness, feeling their way along the rough walls. Dusty knew the cave well, having explored it as a boy. He remembered the secret passages and hidden exits. He led Abigail through a narrow tunnel, their hearts pounding in their chests. They emerged from the back of the cave into a dense thicket of trees. They could hear Bart and his men shouting inside the cave, searching for them. They had to move quickly. Dusty led Abigail through the trees towards a steep cliff overlooking the river. He knew there was a narrow path down the cliff, a treacherous descent that only a skilled climber could navigate. It was their only chance. They reached the edge of the cliff and looked down. The river was far below, its waters churning and swirling. The path was barely visible, a narrow ledge clinging to the side of the cliff. "Can you do it, Abigail?" Dusty asked, his voice filled with concern. Abigail looked at the path, her face pale with fear, but she knew they had no other choice. "I have to," she said, her voice trembling. "I trust you, Dusty." Dusty went first, carefully testing each foothold before placing his weight on it. He helped Abigail down, guiding her every step of the way. The descent was slow and perilous, but they managed to reach the bottom without incident. They found themselves on a narrow strip of beach beside the river. They could hear Bart and his men shouting above them, their voices filled with frustration. They were trapped. Suddenly, Bart and his men appeared at the top of the cliff. They had found the path. Bart pointed his gun at Dusty and Abigail. "It's over," he shouted. "You have nowhere left to run." Dusty looked around, his eyes darting around, searching for a way out. He noticed a cluster of large boulders near the riverbank, partially submerged in the water. An idea sparked in his mind. "Abigail, get behind me," he said, his voice low and urgent, "and stay close." He grabbed a handful of small stones and began throwing them into the river, creating a series of splashes near the boulders. Bart and his men, their vision obscured by the setting sun, couldn't see what Dusty was doing. "What's he up to?" one of Bart's men asked. "Doesn't matter," Bart replied, "just shoot them." But before they could fire, Dusty shouted, "Look out, rattlesnakes." He pointed towards the boulders, pretending to see something dangerous. Bart and his men hesitated, their eyes widening with fear. They knew that rattlesnakes were common in the area. Seizing the opportunity, Dusty grabbed Abigail's hand and pulled her towards the boulders. They scrambled over the rocks, disappearing behind them. Bart and his men, too afraid to follow, remained at the top of the cliff, cursing their bad luck. Dusty and Abigail made their way through the boulders, wading through the cold water. They emerged on the other side, out of sight of Bart and his men. They had outsmarted them again. "We did it," Abigail exclaimed, her voice filled with relief. "We actually did it." Dusty smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Not yet," he said. "We still have to get away. They'll be back." He led Abigail along the riverbank, searching for a safe place to hide. They found a small clearing nestled among the trees, hidden from view. They collapsed on the ground, exhausted and relieved. "Thank you, Dusty," Abigail said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved my life." "I'll always protect you, Abigail," Dusty replied, his voice soft and sincere. "I promise." They looked at each other, their eyes locking in a deep gaze. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a soft, ethereal glow, creating a magical atmosphere. "Abigail," Dusty began, his voice trembling with emotion, I need to tell you something. I've been wanting to say this for a long time, but I never thought I'd have the chance." He took a deep breath and continued, "I love you, Abigail. I've loved you ever since I first saw you back in town. You're the kindest, bravest, and most beautiful woman I know, and I can't imagine my life without you." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Dusty," she whispered, "I love you too. I didn't realize it until now, but I've been in love with you for just as long. You're my hero, Dusty. You saved me from Bart, and you've shown me what it means to be truly happy." They lined in and kissed, their lips meeting in a tender embrace. The kiss was passionate and heartfelt, a culmination of their shared experiences and their growing love for each other. It was a moment of pure bliss, a brief respite from the dangers that surrounded them. They broke apart, their faces flushed with emotion. "What are we going to do now, Dusty?" Abigail asked. "Bart will never give up. He'll keep hunting us until he catches us." "I know," Dusty replied, "but we're not going to let him catch us. We're going to keep running, keep hiding, keep fighting until we're safe, and we're going to do it together." He stood up, pulling Abigail to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's find a place to rest for the night. We need to be ready for whatever tomorrow brings." They walked hand in hand through the trees, searching for a safe place to sleep. After a while, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin. It was dilapidated and overgrown with weeds, but it offered them shelter from the elements. "This will do," Dusty said. "We can clean it up and make it our home, at least for a little while." They went inside and began to clear away the debris. The cabin was small and simple, but it felt like a sanctuary. It was a place where they could rest, recover, and plan their next move. The next few days were spent transforming the dilapidated cabin into a cozy and livable home. Dusty, with his knowledge of carpentry and wilderness survival, took the lead, repairing the roof, patching the walls, and reinforcing the door. Abigail, despite her pampered upbringing, proved to be a quick learner, assisting Dusty with enthusiasm and determination. She helped him gather firewood, clean the cabin, and prepare meals. They worked together as a team, their bond deepening with each passing day. They learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, and to appreciate each other's strengths and weaknesses. Abigail discovered a newfound sense of independence and self-reliance, while Dusty learned to appreciate Abigail's intelligence, her kindness, and her unwavering spirit. They spent their days exploring the surrounding wilderness, learning to identify edible plants, track animals, and navigate by the stars. Dusty taught Abigail how to shoot a rifle and how to defend herself against wild animals. Abigail, in turn, shared her knowledge of literature and music, reading aloud from tattered books she had salvaged from her luggage and singing songs by the campfire. As they worked and learned together, their love for each other grew stronger with each passing day. They found solace in each other's company, comfort in each other's arms, and hope in each other's eyes. They were two souls who had found their way to each other against all odds, and they were determined to build a life together, no matter what the future held. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, Abigail turned to Dusty and said, "I never thought I could be this happy, Dusty. Even before Bart took me, my life felt empty. I had all the money in the world, but I didn't have love. Now I have you, and that's all that matters." Dusty smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "I feel the same way, Abigail," he said. "You've shown me what it means to truly live. I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." Little did they know their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. Bart, fueled by rage and a burning desire for revenge, was closing in. He had tracked them to the cabin, and he was preparing to make his final move. The showdown was coming. Dusty was chopping wood outside the cabin, the rhythmic swing of the axe a familiar and comforting sound. Abigail was inside, mending a tear in one of her dresses. The peace and quiet of the wilderness had lulled them into a false sense of security. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the distance. Dusty stopped chopping wood, his head snapping up. He listened intently, his senses on high alert. He heard the sound again, closer this time. It was definitely someone approaching. He dropped the axe and ran inside the cabin, his face grim. "Abigail," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we have company. Bart's back, and he's brought a lot of men with him." Abigail's eyes widened with fear. "What are we going to do, Dusty?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're going to fight," Dusty replied, his jaw set with determination. "We're not going to let him take you again. We've come too far to give up now." He grabbed his rifle and began to barricade the door and windows. Abigail helped him, pushing furniture against the openings and reinforcing the walls with anything they could find. They knew they were outnumbered, but they were determined to defend their home and their love to the very end. "Do you know how to use this?" Dusty asked, handing Abigail a pistol. "I've had some practice," she said, her voice more confident than she felt, "but I'm not a very good shot." "Just aim and pull the trigger," Dusty said. "And trust me, we'll get through this together." They finished barricading the cabin and took their positions, Dusty by the window and Abigail by the door. They waited in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder and louder, until finally Bart and his men emerged from the trees, their faces grim and determined. "Dusty," Bart shouted, his voice filled with rage, "come out and face me. I know you're in there." Dusty remained silent, his finger on the trigger of his rifle. He knew that this was it, the final showdown. It was time to fight for their lives, for their love, and for their freedom. "He wants us to come out," Dusty said, peering through a crack in the barricaded window. "He thinks he can scare us, but we're not going to give him the satisfaction." "What are we going to do?" Abigail asked, her voice barely audible. "We're going to use the land against him," Dusty replied, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We're going to turn this cabin into a fortress." He grabbed his knife and began to dismantle the furniture, using the wood to create makeshift traps. Abigail, inspired by Dusty's ingenuity, joined in, using her knowledge of plants and herbs to create distractions and deterrents. They worked quickly and efficiently, transforming the area around the cabin into a deadly obstacle course. They dug hidden pits and covered them with leaves, creating camouflaged traps that would ensnare unsuspecting intruders. They strung tripwires across the paths, attaching them to bells and tin cans to alert them to approaching enemies. They smeared thorny bushes with pungent herbs, creating a natural barrier that would deter anyone from getting too close. Dusty also rigged a system of ropes and pulleys that would allow them to drop a heavy log onto anyone who tried to breach the door. Abigail, in turn, created a mixture of stinging nettles and pepper that she planned to throw into the faces of anyone who got too close to the windows. They worked tirelessly, their hands raw and their bodies aching, but they refused to give up. They were fighting for their lives, for their love, and for their freedom. They were determined to make Bart pay for what he had done. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they finished their preparations. The cabin was now a veritable fortress, surrounded by a deadly network of traps and deterrents. They took their positions, their hearts pounding in their chests, and waited for Bart and his men to make their move. They were ready for the final showdown. The battle for their lives was about to begin. The night was dark and still, the only sound the hooting of an owl in the distance. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the ringing of bells. Bart and his men had tripped the tripwires. "They're coming," Dusty shouted, grabbing his rifle. Bart and his men charged towards the cabin, their guns blazing. They stumbled into the hidden pits, their cries of pain echoing through the trees. Others were stung by the thorny bushes, their faces contorted with agony. Dusty and Abigail fired their weapons, picking off the intruders one by one. Bart's men, disoriented and injured, struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain. They were no match for Dusty and Abigail, who knew the land like the back of their hands. As Bart and a few remaining men reached the cabin door, Dusty pulled the rope, sending the heavy log crashing down upon them. The door splintered, and Bart and his men were knocked to the ground, dazed and confused. Abigail, seizing the opportunity, threw the mixture of stinging nettles and pepper into their faces. Bart and his men screamed in agony, clutching at their burning eyes. Dusty and Abigail emerged from the cabin, their rifles trained on Bart and his men. The remaining outlaws, defeated and demoralized, surrendered without a fight. Bart, his face covered in welts and his eyes streaming with tears, glared at Dusty with hatred. "You haven't won yet," he snarled. "I'll get out of here and I'll come back for you." "It's over, Bart," Dusty replied, his voice firm and resolute. "You're going to jail and you're never going to hurt Abigail again." Dusty and Abigail tied up Bart and his men and waited for the authorities to arrive. When the sheriff finally arrived, he was amazed by what he saw. He had never seen anything like it. Bart and his men were taken into custody, and Dusty and Abigail were hailed as heroes. Bart was eventually tried and convicted of his crimes, and he was sentenced to a long prison term. Justice had finally been served. With Bart behind bars, Dusty and Abigail were finally free to start their new life together. Abigail's family, relieved that she was safe, urged her to return home and reclaim her inheritance. But Abigail had made a decision. She had found her true home, not in a mansion filled with riches, but in the wilderness with the man she loved. "I'm not going back, Father," Abigail said, her voice firm and resolute. "I've found my place here with Dusty. This is where I belong." Her father, though initially disappointed, eventually came to understand and respect her decision. He gave her his blessing and promised to visit them often. Dusty and Abigail spent the next few years building a life together in the wilderness. They expanded the cabin, planting a garden and raising livestock. They learned to live off the land, hunting, fishing, and foraging for food. They faced many challenges, but they always faced them together, their love for each other growing stronger with each passing day. They had children, strong and healthy boys and girls who grew